From the endless steppes of Central Asia, a storm once rose that would change the fate of the world forever. The Mongol Empire, born from scattered nomadic tribes, expanded with a speed and ferocity history had never witnessed before. From China to Europe, from the sands of Persia to the icy forests of Russia, they forged the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But behind the conquests lay a story far deeper, a tale of ruthless ambition, brilliant strategy, cultural exchange, and a legacy that still shapes our world today. This is not just the story of Genghis Khan, it is the entire story of the Mongol Empire. When we talk about empires, most people immediately think of the grandeur of Rome, the splendor of Persia, or perhaps the longevity of China's dynasties. Yet, in the long timeline of human civilization, there was one empire that eclipsed them all in sheer geographic scope, an empire so vast that it stitched together the known world from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the plains of Eastern Europe. This was the Mongol Empire. At its zenith in the 13th and 14th centuries, the Mongols controlled an expanse of land covering roughly 33 million square kilometers. To put that into perspective, their dominion was larger than the Roman Empire at its height, larger than Alexander the Great's fleeting conquests, and larger even than the Ottoman Empire after centuries of expansion. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, a belt of power stretching unbroken across Eurasia. The numbers themselves almost defy comprehension. Imagine traveling thousands of kilometers west from the coastlines of China and Korea, across deserts, mountains, and endless grasslands, and still remaining under the same imperial authority until you reach the steppes of Ukraine or the banks of the Danube River. That seamless stretch of control without a rival power blocking the way is something no other empire managed to achieve. And unlike maritime empires of later centuries, whose power was distributed across oceans, the Mongols ruled over continuous land, making their empire an interconnected organism of trade, conquest, and governance. The legacy of the Mongols is not only preserved in maps or borders, but also etched deep into the very bloodlines of millions alive today. Genetic studies in the early 21st century revealed a startling truth. About 8% of men across Asia, nearly 16 million individuals, carry a Y chromosome that is almost identical, all of which can be traced back to a single male ancestor who lived roughly 8 centuries ago. Scholars widely agree that this mysterious figure was none other than Genghis Khan, the Great Khan, who founded the largest land empire in history. This discovery not only demonstrates the immense demographic impact the Mongols left behind, but also reflects the social, political, and cultural power of their ruling elite. Through conquest, the practice of polygamy, and political alliances cemented by marriage, the bloodline of the Great Khan spread far beyond the harsh Mongolian steppes, reaching Persia, Central Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe. Many dynasties, tribes, and noble families intertwined their destinies with the House of Khan, turning that lineage into a quiet yet enduring thread of human history. Very few figures in history have left a mark so literally inscribed in the genetic code of mankind, and Genghis Khan is one of those rare exceptions. The legacy of the Mongol Empire carries within it an undeniable paradox. For alongside its great achievements, it also left behind the mark of one of the most terrifying forces of destruction in human history. Contemporary accounts, especially those from survivors of the sieges of Nishapur, Baghdad, or Kiev, describe scenes of unimaginable horror, entire populations slaughtered without mercy, libraries filled with the accumulated knowledge of humanity reduced to ashes, irrigation systems that once sustained entire regions smashed beyond repair, and prosperous cities turned into smoking ruins. To many cultures, the image of the Mongols was nothing short of a nightmare, a storm of horsemen impossible to stop. Descending upon their lands with cold and merciless precision, modern estimates suggest that these campaigns may have claimed the lives of tens of millions of people, a demographic shockwave so immense that it would not be rivaled until the world wars of the 20th century. This devastation not only obliterated individual lives but also erased cultural memory and spiritual heritage, extinguishing the brilliance of once thriving civilizations. However, to view the Mongol Empire solely as agents of destruction would be to miss half of the historical picture. Alongside their brutal conquests, they also became the architects of an unprecedented level of connectivity in the medieval world. By uniting an immense stretch of land, from the Far East to Eastern Europe, under a single political umbrella, the Mongols opened up the arteries of trade, diplomacy, and culture, transforming Eurasia into a vast network of exchange. The Silk Road, once fragmented and perilous for centuries, was revived with newfound vigor. Caravans could now journey from Chang'an, across the Gobi Desert, through Persia, and deep into Europe with a level of safety rarely seen before. Thanks to the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace maintained through iron discipline and widespread fear. Under this protection, merchants, artisans, missionaries, and even explorers like Marco Polo carried goods, technologies, and knowledge across the continent. Paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing techniques flowed westward from the east, while art, medicine, agricultural knowledge, and new crops moved in the opposite direction. In this way, a form of early globalization began to emerge. East and West were no longer isolated worlds, but interconnected links in the same chain. The Mongol Empire, though remembered for blood and steel, inadvertently became the architects who laid the foundation for the globally connected world that followed. The story of the Mongols has always carried a profound contradiction. They were both destroyers who spread terror and builders who paved the way for progress. To many chroniclers and communities of their time, they appeared only as ruthless conquerors, leaving behind wastelands, ashes, and rivers stained with blood. Yet, from another perspective, the Mongols were the first to create a proto-global system where East and West were no longer entirely isolated but woven together into a shared fabric of humanity. Such perceptions depended greatly on the observer's standpoint. To a Persian historian who witnessed the tragedy of Baghdad in 1258, the Mongols were nothing but embodiments of destruction. Conversely, to a Venetian merchant benefiting from safe trade routes along the Silk Road, they were guardians of opportunity and prosperity. It is precisely this paradox that makes Mongol history so compelling. They were at once humanity's greatest nightmare and a catalyst for global connection. And somewhere between these two extremes lies the true portrait of the empire. Thus, the Mongol Empire begins for us not simply as a tale of battles and khans, but as a puzzle of legacy. It challenges us to think beyond easy categories of good and evil, of destroyer and builder. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that history's greatest powers often embody both extremes at once. The Mongols remind us that empire is never a singular story. It is always a tapestry of triumph and tragedy. cruelty and creativity, death and continuity. And as we embark on this journey through their rise, conquests, and eventual decline, one central question will guide us: were the Mongols the world's greatest destroyers? Or were they the reluctant architects of the first global age? Long before the Mongol Empire erupted onto the world stage, the vast grasslands of Central Asia had already shaped generations of people into survivors, warriors, and wanderers. The steppe was an unforgiving teacher. Winters were mercilessly cold, summers burned with dry heat, and food was never guaranteed. Farming in such a climate was nearly impossible. So the people of the steppe built their lives around mobility. Their wealth was measured not in gold or cities, but in herds, horses, sheep, goats, and camels. These animals were not just possessions, but the lifeblood of nomadic existence, providing milk, meat, clothing, and transport. In a world of endless horizons, it was the horse that defined freedom, speed, and survival. From childhood, steppe nomads learned to ride so naturally that some chroniclers remarked a Mongol child could ride before he could walk. This bond with the horse made the people of the steppe not merely herders, but natural cavalry, unparalleled in their ability to move swiftly across vast distances. Yet life on the steppe was never peaceful. The scarcity of resources, the shifting patterns of grazing land, and the constant pressure of survival bred conflict. Tribes clashed over pastures, herds, and honor, creating a society where warfare was not an occasional disruption, but an integral rhythm of life. Every boy grew up knowing that he might one day ride into battle, and every tribe understood that strength was the only guarantee of security. Raiding was as common as trading, and the line between neighbor and enemy could shift overnight. This ceaseless cycle of conflict forged the steppe peoples into hardened warriors, accustomed to discipline, endurance, and the brutal realities of combat. In time, this culture of constant strife would prove to be the crucible from which an empire of conquest could be born. Alongside this martial way of life, belief systems rooted the steppe peoples in a spiritual world as vast and mysterious as the sky above them. At the heart of their worldview was Tengri, the eternal blue sky, a deity that embodied both fate and cosmic order. To live under the endless steppe sky was to feel directly connected to this divine presence, and rulers often claimed their authority as a mandate from Tengri himself. Shamans acted as intermediaries between the human world and the spirit realm, conducting rituals to ensure prosperity, healing, or victory in battle. Nature was alive with power mountains, rivers, and the open heavens themselves were sacred. This spirituality was not codified like the scriptures of settled civilizations, but it infused every aspect of nomadic life with a sense of destiny and collective strength. In battle, warriors fought not only for survival or plunder, but under the conviction that the vast sky willed their path. This combination, the harsh environment, the warrior ethos, and the unifying faith in Tengri, produced a civilization that was paradoxically invisible and inevitable. To outsiders, the nomads of the steppe seemed scattered, primitive, and disorganized. They left behind no great monuments, no permanent cities, no libraries of written knowledge. Yet beneath this surface of fragmentation lay the potential for something extraordinary. Every tribe carried the seeds of martial power. Every rider embodied the skill to dominate far beyond the horizon. And every belief in the eternal sky carried the idea of unity under a single chosen leader. For centuries, No figure had managed to bind these tribes together for long. Rivalries and blood feuds always tore alliances apart. But the ingredients were there, simmering beneath the surface. All that was needed was one man strong enough, ruthless enough, and visionary enough to weld the scattered clans of the steppe into a single, unstoppable force. When that leader finally emerged, the world would change forever. The story of the Mongol Empire begins not with wealth or privilege, but with abandonment and hardship. Around 1162, on the remote steppes of Mongolia, a boy named Temujin was born into the Borjigin clan. His early life was marked not by power, but by loss. When his father, a minor tribal chieftain, was poisoned by rivals, Temujin was still a child. Overnight, his family's fragile hold on authority collapsed. His mother and siblings were cast out, left to fend for themselves in the harshest environment on earth. Without allies, without protection, the young Temujin grew up on the edge of survival, hunting small animals, gathering roots, and enduring the cruelty of rival tribes who saw weakness as an opportunity for exploitation. This crucible of poverty and betrayal forged in Temujin a character both ruthless and determined. Where others might have broken, he learned resilience. Where other tribal leaders relied on aristocratic birth or inherited prestige, Temujin understood that loyalty must be earned, and once earned, fiercely maintained. He began to gather followers not through empty promises, but through a radical idea: merit mattered more than bloodline. Warriors who served with discipline, courage, and loyalty would rise in rank regardless of their ancestry. In a society fractured by endless clan rivalries and aristocratic pride, this was revolutionary. Still, Temujin's path to power was not smooth. He endured years of capture, imprisonment, and betrayal. But each setback only sharpened his resolve. He forged alliances strategically, marrying into powerful clans, negotiating with rivals, and slowly building a coalition around his vision of unity. Unlike other chieftains who treated alliances as temporary conveniences, Temujin demanded discipline and structure. He created a strict code of law, ensuring that betrayal would be punished with death, while loyalty was rewarded with wealth and honor. This uncompromising insistence on order transformed his growing band of followers from a loose collection of riders into a disciplined warband bound by iron loyalty. By the late 12th century, Temujin had gathered enough strength to challenge the great powers of the steppe. Through battle and diplomacy, he broke old tribal hierarchies and incorporated rival clans into his fold. What made him unique was not merely his military skill, but his vision. The steppe had always been a land of division, where alliances splintered as quickly as they were made. Temujin recognized that if the Mongols were to rise, they had to rise together. He demanded unity not as a dream, but as a necessity for survival. This vision reached its climax in 1206, when Temujin summoned a great council of tribal leaders. At that gathering, his rivals and allies alike acknowledged his supremacy, proclaiming him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It was more than a title. It was a declaration that the age of fragmented clans had ended. For the first time, the tribes of the Mongolian steppe were bound under a single leader, their quarrels set aside in service of a greater destiny. The moment was historic. In less than a generation, a boy who had once been abandoned in the wilderness now stood as the supreme ruler of a united people. And with unity came power. The horsemen who once fought each other would now ride together, forged into a weapon that could strike in any direction. What the world saw as scattered tribes, Genghis Khan transformed into an empire in waiting. The unification of the Mongols was not just a political achievement, it was the ignition of a force that would soon thunder across continents. Genghis Khan's genius lay not simply in conquest, but in transformation. He had taken a fractured, war-torn society and turned it into an engine of discipline and ambition. The Mongols, once overlooked as little more than raiders of the steppe, were now a single, unified people under the eternal blue sky, prepared to ride out and claim the world. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes in 1206, he inherited not a state in the traditional sense, but a people shaped by the steppe riders, hunters, and warriors accustomed to a life of hardship. His genius lay in turning this raw human material into the most disciplined and efficient military machine the medieval world had ever seen. The Mongol army was not just a band of raiders, it was an institution, structured with mathematical precision, driven by iron discipline, and equipped with tactics so effective that they toppled kingdoms from China to Hungary. At the heart of the Mongol military system was a radical innovation in organization, the decimal system. Genghis Khan divided his forces into units of 10, called Arban. 10 of these made a Jagun 100 men. 10 Jagun formed a Mingan 1. Arban men and 10 Mingan created a Tumen 10,000 men. This system ensured clarity of command and accountability at every level. No matter the size of an army, it could be broken down into predictable, manageable components. The system also broke apart traditional clan loyalties. Instead of fighting alongside their blood relatives, warriors were distributed across different units, forced to bond with comrades from other tribes. In this way, Genghis Khan dismantled old feuds and created loyalty to the army itself, and ultimately, to him, it was a masterstroke of social engineering. The decimal structure was not just military mathematics, but a political tool that forged unity where division had once reigned. If the decimal system was the skeleton of the Mongol army, then the horse and the bow were its beating heart. Mongol warriors were, above all, cavalrymen, born to the saddle and trained from childhood in archery. The steppe pony, small but tough, could cover astonishing distances and survive on sparse grazing, making it perfect for campaigns that stretched across deserts and mountains. Each warrior brought several horses, allowing the army to rotate mounts and travel with shocking speed, sometimes 100 kilometers in a single day. The Mongol bow was a weapon of devastating power. Unlike the longbows of England or the crossbows of Europe, the composite recurve bow used by the Mongols was compact, perfectly suited for shooting while riding, crafted from wood, horn, and sinew. It could unleash arrows with enough force to pierce armor at over 200 meters. Combined with the mobility of cavalry, this weapon allowed the Mongols to strike from a distance, harassing enemies with clouds of arrows before closing in for the kill. Their mastery of mounted archery was so complete that even heavily armored knights in Europe found themselves helpless against swarms of riders who attacked, retreated, and circled back with unrelenting precision. Speed itself was a weapon. The Mongols could appear where they were least expected, crossing vast distances to strike at the heart of an enemy's territory before defenders could organize. Armies that relied on slow-moving infantry or supply wagons could not hope to match such mobility. For enemies accustomed to traditional siege warfare or pitched battles, the Mongols seemed less like an army and more like a natural disaster, sudden, unpredictable, unstoppable. But the Mongol war machine was not built on weapons alone. It was also built on the psychology of terror. Genghis Khan and his generals understood that fear could be as effective as arrows. When faced with resistance, they did not hesitate to annihilate entire cities, leaving survivors to spread tales of horror. Whole populations were massacred as deliberate examples, ensuring that the next city would surrender without a fight. This reputation preceded them across Eurasia. In many cases, Mongol victories came not from battle, but from intimidation. Defenders abandoned their walls. Rulers fled, and empires collapsed at the mere rumor of an approaching Mongol army. The Mongols also mastered the art of deception. They staged feigned retreats, drawing enemies into ambushes. They spread false information to confuse and divide opposing forces. Even their battlefield formations were designed to bewilder, with swarms of riders appearing to encircle armies larger than their own. Victory was as much about breaking the enemy's will as breaking their bodies. What made all of this possible was the unyielding discipline imposed by Genghis Khan. In the steppe world, tribal leaders often tolerated betrayal, shifting alliances, and personal rivalries. Genghis Khan could not afford such chaos. In his army, loyalty was absolute, and betrayal meant death, cowardice, desertion, or failure to obey orders was punished with merciless severity. Yet, the system was not only about punishment. Soldiers were rewarded with spoils from conquest, distributed fairly to reinforce loyalty. Leaders who succeeded in battle gained prestige and rank, regardless of their ancestry. In this way, the Mongol army became a meritocracy, bound together by discipline and opportunity. This strict code extended beyond the battlefield. The Mongol military was also a logistical marvel, capable of sustaining itself in the harshest conditions. Soldiers were trained to survive on minimal rations, even drinking the blood of their horses in emergencies. They carried dried meat and milk curds, lightweight foods that allowed long campaigns without supply trains. The resilience and adaptability of each warrior made the entire army function like a self-sufficient organism, capable of surviving where others would starve. Though renowned for their cavalry strength and lightning-fast victories across the steppe, Genghis Khan and his generals clearly understood their own limits against fortified city walls. Horses and arrows alone could not prevail. This self-awareness made the Mongols true masters of adaptation. They did not hesitate to learn and absorb the technologies of the peoples they conquered. From the Chinese, they adopted sophisticated siege-craft, stone-throwing catapults, fire lancers, rams, and even early gunpowder-based weapons from Persian and Arab engineers. They gained expertise in tunneling, mining, operating mangonels, as well as advanced techniques of fortification and demolition. Genghis Khan often spared artisans, engineers, and scholars, turning them into indispensable cogs in his vast war machine. The consequences were devastating. No fortress could any longer be considered impregnable. Walls that had shielded civilizations for centuries suddenly appeared fragile against the fusion of foreign ingenuity and steppe mobility. The sieges of Zhongdu, modern Beijing, and Samarkand revealed the terror in full cities could be starved into exhaustion, bombarded with stone and fire, or forced to face unfamiliar weapons that spread panic and destruction. By merging unmatched mobility with borrowed siege technology, the Mongols forged a hybrid style of warfare so unique and overwhelming that opponents from east to west were left powerless to resist. Taken together, these elements formed a military unlike any the world had ever seen. The decimal organization gave it structure. The horse and bow gave it speed and lethality. Psychological warfare magnified its impact. Discipline kept it unified, and borrowed technologies allowed it to overcome even the strongest defenses. It was not merely an army, but a system, a self-perpetuating machine capable of adapting, innovating, and crushing anything in its path. To contemporaries, the Mongol army seemed invincible, and in many ways, it was. Within a single generation, this war machine would sweep across continents, toppling dynasties, destroying cities, and redrawing the map of the world. Yet its foundation lay in simple principles: discipline, mobility, adaptability, and above all, unity under the vision of Genghis Khan. The world had never faced anything like it before, and once unleashed, the Mongol war machine would not rest until the known world trembled. In 1206, when Genghis Khan united the once fragmented Mongol tribes into a single force, the world beyond the steppe still looked upon them with disdain. To the great dynasties of China, Persia, or Europe, the Mongols were nothing more than bands of barbaric horsemen, accustomed to raiding but incapable of threatening civilizations that had endured for centuries. Yet this perception was about to be overturned. Within only a few decades, Mongol cavalry thundered across the deserts of northern China, surged over mountains, swept through the vast steppes, and pressed deep into the forests of Eastern Europe. They did not merely defeat their enemies, they erased dynasties, consigned ancient cities to flames, and left millions in terror. This was not simply conquest, but a wholesale remapping of the political and cultural order of the medieval world. The very first major campaign, after unifying the Mongol tribes, was Genghis Khan's assault on the western Xia kingdom, a Tangut dynasty in northwestern China. Compared to the surrounding giants, like the Jin or the Song, western Xia was smaller in scale, yet it was wealthy, fortified, and seasoned in resisting nomadic invasions. For the newly consolidated Mongols, it was the perfect target to test their strength. In 1209, Genghis Khan launched the expedition. Unlike the old-fashioned raids of the past, the Mongol army now carried not only its lightning-fast cavalry, but also newly acquired siege technologies learned from Chinese engineers. This campaign revealed two defining traits of Mongol warfare: relentless perseverance and merciless punishment. One city after another fell under their unyielding sieges, and whenever resistance proved stubborn, Genghis Khan demonstrated his willingness to annihilate entire populations as a warning. By 1210, Western Xia had submitted, agreeing to pay tribute and provide troops for Mongol campaigns. Yet this was not the end. Years later, when Western Xia refused to send soldiers for further expeditions, Genghis Khan regarded it as an unforgivable act of betrayal. In 1227, during the final months of his life, he returned in fury. The Western Xia capital was razed to the ground, the royal family nearly exterminated, and the entire dynasty reduced to ashes. This event not only erased a kingdom from history, but also set a lasting precedent. Any who dared to defy the Mongols would face absolute destruction. From Western Xia, the world came to realize that Genghis Khan was not merely a horse raider of the steppe, but a supreme commander willing to carve his law into Asia itself with fire and blood. After forcing Western Xia into submission, Genghis Khan recognized that the door was now open to a far greater adversary, the Jin dynasty, led by the Jurchen, which ruled over the whole of northern China. For centuries, the Jin had been regarded as one of the strongest powers of medieval Asia, commanding fertile lands, prosperous cities, tens of millions of people, and a seasoned administrative and military apparatus to the elites of the region. The idea that a nomadic people from the steppe could challenge such a state was almost unthinkable. But Genghis Khan did not see invulnerability. He saw a strategic opportunity. He understood that the wealth of the Jin masked deep weaknesses, a bloated bureaucracy, factional rivalries, and blind reliance on static defenses such as walls and fortresses against an enemy that thrived on speed, discipline, and an ever-increasing mastery of siegecraft. Those very walls became traps that shackled the defenders. In 1211, Genghis Khan made his move. The Mongol armies surged across the Great Wall, once believed to be the ultimate bulwark against steppe invaders. But this time, instead of halting them, the wall marked the beginning of a campaign that would shake the entire East. The Mongols did not hurl themselves recklessly against strongholds. Instead, they employed flexible tactics, bypassing fortresses, cutting supply lines, isolating enemy armies from their bases, and striking suddenly at forces many times their size. The Battle of Yehuling that same year became a turning point. There, Genghis Khan deliberately lured the Jin into narrow terrain, where his mobile cavalry could easily surround them, delivering a devastating ambush that slaughtered tens of thousands in chaos. Over the next decade, the Mongols relentlessly pressed their assault into the very heart of the Jin. The capital, Zhengdu, modern Beijing, endured repeated sieges, famine, and crisis. The climax came in 1250, when the city finally fell. Contemporary accounts describe an apocalypse, flames consuming the capital, black smoke rising to the sky, streets clogged with corpses, and the wails of survivors echoing like a requiem for a power once thought unassailable. The conquest of the Jin carried significance far beyond the battlefield. It gave the Mongols direct access to the immense food supplies of Chinese agriculture, a treasury of advanced siege technologies from native engineers, and the material foundation for campaigns further west. Equally important, it delivered a psychological shock. A nomadic empire, long dismissed as barbaric, had humbled one of the world's great civilizations. From that moment onward, the legend of Mongol invincibility began to etch itself into human memory, spreading fear from Asia to Europe. After subduing the northern dynasties of China, Genghis Khan turned his gaze westward toward a seemingly worthy adversary, the Khwarezmian Empire, stretching from Central Asia into Persia, with prosperous cities such as Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur, and commanding key arteries of the Silk Road. At first, his ambitions were not for bloodshed, but for trading. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a large caravan of several hundred merchants to the court of Sultan Ala-ad-Din Muhammad II, hoping to establish commercial ties and inaugurate a mutually beneficial era of exchange. Yet instead of welcoming them, the Shah viewed the move with suspicion. Fearing the traders were spies, he ordered their arrest and execution. Even then, Genghis Khan attempted diplomacy. He dispatched envoys demanding explanation and restitution. But error compounded error. Ala ad-Din not only rejected reconciliation, but killed one envoy and humiliated the others. This was a personal affront to Genghis Khan and an unforgivable act in nomadic culture, where the safety of envoys was sacred. With this rash decision, the Khwarezmian ruler had effectively signed the death warrant of his empire. In 1219, the Mongols crossed the Syr Darya River with an army estimated at 200,000 cavalry and infantry. This was no ordinary war, but a punitive expedition of annihilation. The city of Bukhara, a center of religion and scholarship, fell quickly. Tradition records that, inside the Grand Mosque, Genghis Khan addressed the trembling citizens, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." These words seared into memory, transforming the campaign into a verdict that transcended politics. Samarkand, the jewel of Central Asia, with formidable walls and a large garrison, soon met the same fate. Mongol cavalry employed encirclement, cut off supplies, and combined catapults and fire tactics learned from China, forcing the supposedly impregnable defenses to collapse. Once the city fell, defenders and civilians alike were slaughtered or enslaved. At Nishapur, after the death of a Mongol prince, Genghis Khan ordered vengeance so total that the city was leveled. Chronicles claim that hundreds of thousands were killed in the bloodbath. Meanwhile, Shah Ala-ad-Din fled westward, carrying with him the shame and ruin of his empire. He died in exile, a ghost of the power he had once wielded. The Mongols did not stop at occupying the cities. They pursued their enemies to the Caspian Sea and into the Caucasus, clashing with Georgians and the Rus principalities. This expansion proved the campaign was not mere revenge, but also a calculated step to project Mongol influence to the very edge of Europe. The Khwarezmian Empire disappeared in only a few years, a stark lesson that defiance of the Mongols did not bring negotiation, but extermination. The once vibrant urban network of the Silk Road lay in ruins, and control of transcontinental trade routes fell decisively into Mongol hands. From then on, their power was measured not only by victories on the battlefield, but also by the fear they instilled across Asia, an invisible weapon as effective as sword and bow. After crushing the Khwarezmian Empire, the Mongol cavalry did not stop in Central Asia. From the 1220s, and especially during the 1230s, 1240s, they began to push deeper into Europe. For the Rus, Poland, and Hungary, these mounted armies from the east appeared like a storm of fire sweeping in from the edge of the known world, a force that no one could imagine resisting. In 1237, Batu, the grandson of Genghis Khan, led the invasion of the Rus principalities, one after another: Ryazan, Vladimir, and finally, Kiev fell under siege. Chronicles record that entire populations were slaughtered or carried off into slavery, their cities reduced to ashes. Kiev, the pride of Slavic civilization and the spiritual heart of Eastern Christianity, was obliterated in 1240 after centuries of glory. From there, the Mongols advanced further west, pouring into Poland and Hungary. The Battle of Legnica in 1241 became a nightmare for Europe. A grand coalition of Polish knights, German cavalry, crusaders, and Templar forces gathered to stop the threat. Yet they quickly fell victim to the Mongols' familiar stratagem, feigned retreats that broke enemy formations, followed by encirclement and total destruction. Only days later in Hungary, the Mongols struck another decisive blow, annihilating King Bela IV's army at the Battle of Mohi. News of these disasters spread across the continent, sowing panic from Vienna to Paris. Many believed that the end of Christendom itself was imminent. And yet, just as Europe braced for its downfall, the Mongols unexpectedly withdrew in 1242. The cause was not military defeat, but a succession crisis: the death of Ögedei Khan, son and successor of Genghis, compelled the princes to return to Mongolia for the election of a new great Khan. By this stroke of fate, Europe was spared not by its own strength, but by the internal politics of the Eastern Empire. Still, the memory of burning cities, blood-soaked fields, and once mighty armies swept away never vanished. It lingered as a haunting reminder for centuries, a warning that Europe had once come within a breath of being trampled beneath the hooves of the Mongols. By the mid-13th century, the scale of Mongol conquest was without precedent. From the shores of the Sea of Japan in the east to the banks of the Danube River in the west, from the Siberian taiga in the north to the deserts of Persia in the south, the Mongol Empire stretched like a vast belt across Eurasia. It encompassed China, Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, and large swathes of Eastern Europe. No empire in history had ever controlled such a contiguous expanse of land. The Mongols were not merely conquerors of nations, they were reshapers of the world order. Their campaigns redrew maps, shifted trade routes, toppled dynasties, and terrified entire civilizations. To some, they were the horsemen of the apocalypse. To others, reluctant architects of a new global era. But to all, they were unforgettable. In 1237, at the height of his power, Genghis Khan died. The exact circumstances remain shrouded in mystery. Some chronicles suggest he succumbed to illness after years of campaigning. Others claim he was injured in battle against the Western Shia and never recovered. But one detail binds all the accounts together. The location of his burial was deliberately concealed. According to tradition, his funeral cortege killed every living thing encountered along the path to his grave so that none could reveal where the great Khan lay. Horses trampled the ground to erase the site, and the secret was kept with fanatical devotion. To this day, despite centuries of speculation and countless expeditions, the tomb of Genghis Khan has never been found. His absence from the archaeological record has transformed into one of history's most tantalizing mysteries, a fitting legacy for a man who had remade the world yet chose to vanish into it. The death of Genghis Khan did not mean the end of the Mongol Empire, but it did mark a profound turning point. With no single figure towering over them, the Mongol elite faced the challenge of preserving unity across an empire so vast it stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian. Genghis had carefully prepared for this moment, dividing his conquests among his sons and grandsons, while insisting that the supreme authority of the great Khan would remain in Mongolia. Still, the centrifugal forces of distance, ambition, and culture soon began to pull the empire apart. From this division emerged the four great khanates, each a fragment of the colossal whole, each shaped by the geography and politics of its domain. In the west, Genghis's grandson Batu Khan established the Golden Horde, ruling over the vast steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe. Centered along the Volga River, it dominated the principalities of Rus, extracting tribute and ensuring Mongol supremacy over the Slavic world for centuries. The Golden Horde brought Europe face to face with Mongol power, leaving a deep imprint on Russian history, culture, and politics. For Western chroniclers, it was the Horde that embodied the fearsome Tatar yoke, a reminder that the Mongols were not distant conquerors, but neighbors who could ride west at will. To the southwest, another grandson, Hulagu Khan, carved out the Ilkhanate. Based in Persia and Mesopotamia, it was here, in 1258, that the Mongols carried out one of the most infamous acts in their history, the sack of Baghdad, which ended the Abbasid Caliphate and sent shockwaves through the Islamic world. The Ilkhanate became a Mongol dynasty ruling over Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia, blending steppe traditions with Persian administrative sophistication. Over time, it would also serve as a crucible for cultural exchange, as Mongols adopted Islam and Persian culture, leaving a legacy far deeper than conquest alone. At the heart of Central Asia lay the Chagatai Khanate, named after Genghis's second son, Chagatai, stretching across the Silk Road from the steppes to the mountains. This Khanate became both a bridge and a buffer between East and West. It retained much of the traditional nomadic spirit, but its position along the great trade routes meant it also absorbed influences from Persia, India, and China. For centuries, it would remain a contested, shifting realm, fragmented yet vital in maintaining the Mongols' presence in Central Asia. In the East, the most ambitious legacy was claimed by Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis. By 1271, he proclaimed the Yuan dynasty, establishing himself as Emperor of China and ruling from a new capital in what is now Beijing. The Yuan represented the Mongols' transformation from conquerors of the steppe to rulers of one of the world's oldest and richest civilizations. Under Kublai, the Mongol Empire reached its formal peak, recognized not only as a military power, but also as a dynasty within the Chinese imperial tradition. Though the empire was now divided, these khanates were not isolated states. They remained linked by shared heritage, by trade routes, and by the symbolic authority of the great Khan in Mongolia. Yet the unity of Genghis's reign could not be sustained. Rivalries between branches of the family flared, and the logistical impossibility of ruling from a single center made true cohesion a dream. Still, in division there was continuity. Each Khanate carried the Mongol legacy into its own world, the Golden Horde into Russia, the Ilkhanate into Persia, the Chagatai into Central Asia, the Yuan into China. Together, they ensured that even after Genghis Khan's death, the imprint of Mongol conquest stretched across continents, and yet the shadow of their founder lingered most of all. For while the empire splintered into 4 thrones, the tomb of Genghis Khan remained hidden, a silent reminder that the man who had united the steppes and shaken the earth could still defy the grasp of history itself. The death of Genghis Khan in 1247 might have fractured a lesser empire, but the machinery he had built disciplined armies, a system of loyalty, and a vision of conquest carried on under his descendants. If Genghis was the storm that broke open the gates of the world, his heirs were the floodwaters that poured through. Over the next half-century, the Mongol Empire did not shrink but expanded, reaching its greatest territorial extent and reshaping Eurasia in ways that still echo today. The age of the successors was the true peak of Mongol power, an era of astonishing conquests, brutal destruction, and unprecedented global connection. The first to inherit the mantle of Great Khan was Ögedei, the third son of Genghis, chosen in part for his temperament, less ruthless than some of his brothers, yet firm and pragmatic. Ögedei was crowned in 1229. His reign marked the consolidation of the empire's eastern conquests and the opening of a new front Europe. Ögedei continued his father's campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China. By 1234, with Mongol armies pressing relentlessly, the Jin collapsed, their emperor dead and their lands absorbed into the empire. This victory opened the fertile plains of northern China and provided the resources needed for further campaigns westward. It was under Ögedei that the Mongols surged deep into Europe. Commanded by Batu Khan and the brilliant General Subutai, Mongol armies swept across the Russian steppe, crushing cities like Vladimir and Kiev. In 1241, they thundered into Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Legnica, a European coalition was annihilated, and at the Battle of Mohi, the Hungarian kingdom was devastated. Chroniclers in Vienna and even Paris trembled at reports that the horsemen of the East were advancing inexorably. Europe seemed on the verge of collapse. Only the sudden death of Ögedei in 1241 halted the campaign. The Mongols withdrew to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan, sparing Europe for the moment. Ögedei's reign demonstrated the terrifying scale of Mongol ambition from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Germany. No land seemed beyond their reach. If Ögedei brought terror to Europe, it was Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, who brought apocalypse to the Middle East, tasked by his brother, the great Khan Mongke. With conquering Persia and the Islamic world, Hulagu led a massive campaign westward. His most infamous achievement came in 1258 with the siege of Baghdad. For centuries, Baghdad had been the jewel of the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a center of learning, trade, and culture, home to libraries and scholars who preserved the wisdom of antiquity. To Muslims, it was a city of faith and intellect. To the world, it was a symbol of civilization itself. The Mongols showed no reverence for its glory. Hulagu's armies surrounded Baghdad, cutting off its supplies. Despite desperate resistance, the walls fell. What followed was a catastrophe etched into memory. The Caliph al-Mustasim was executed, the Abbasid Caliphate ended, and the city was pillaged. Chroniclers tell of libraries thrown into the Tigris River, their ink blackening the waters. Hundreds of thousands perished. The sack of Baghdad was not just the destruction of a city, it was the symbolic end of a golden age of Islam. The Ilkhanate, Hulagu's new domain, stretched across Persia and Mesopotamia, fusing Mongol rule with the traditions of the Middle East. Though the Ilkhanate would eventually embrace Islam and Persian culture, its birth was a wound that scarred Islamic history forever. While Hulagu shaped the Middle East, another grandson, Batu Khan, left an equally lasting imprint on Eastern Europe. Batu was the commander of the Great Western Campaign during Ögedei's reign, and though his advance into Europe halted after 1241, his power remained formidable. Establishing his capital along the Volga River, Batu created the Golden Horde, a khanate that dominated the Rus principalities for centuries. The Russians called it the Tatar yoke, a system of tribute and subjugation that defined their political life. Princes had to travel to the Horde's court to receive approval for their rule. Failure to comply brought swift punishment. Under Batu and his successors, the Golden Horde became both feared and influential. It ensured Mongol supremacy on the steppe, controlled the trade routes linking Europe and Asia, and integrated Russia into the wider Mongol world. For generations, Russian identity and politics were shaped in the shadow of the Horde. Even as Muscovy eventually rose to challenge Mongol dominance, the legacy of Batu's rule lingered in the structures of Russian autocracy and centralization. Among Genghis Khan's heirs, none left a mark as profound as Kublai Khan, the grandson who turned the Mongol Empire into a world-spanning dynasty. Unlike his brothers and cousins, Kublai was drawn not only to conquest but also to governance. He immersed himself in Chinese culture, studied Confucian traditions, and surrounded himself with advisors who understood the complexities of ruling a sedentary empire. In 1271, he declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, claiming the mandate of heaven and positioning himself not merely as a conqueror, but as the legitimate emperor of China. By 1279, his armies had crushed the Southern Song dynasty, completing the Mongol conquest of all of China. For the first time in history, the entire Chinese world was under foreign rule. Kublai moved the imperial capital to what is now Beijing, transforming it into the center of a vast, multicultural empire. His court dazzled foreign visitors like Marco Polo, who described a realm of immense wealth, elaborate ceremonies, and global connections. Under Kublai, the Mongol Empire reached its formal peak not just in size, but in cultural significance. Trade along the Silk Road flourished, linking East Asia with Europe. Technologies, ideas, and religions flowed across the empire with unprecedented speed. Yet Kublai's reign also revealed the contradictions of Mongol rule. While he presided over prosperity and cosmopolitanism, he struggled to balance the nomadic traditions of his ancestors with the bureaucratic demands of ruling China. Costly campaigns against Japan, Vietnam, and Java failed, draining resources and exposing the limits of Mongol expansion. Still, in sheer grandeur and influence, Kublai Khan represented the zenith of Mongol power. By the late 13th century, under the leadership of Ögedei, Hulagu, Batu, and Kublai, the Mongol Empire spanned from the Sea of Japan to the Danube, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. Never before had so much of the known world been linked under one system. Despite its divisions into khanates, the empire maintained a sense of shared identity and purpose. The successors of Genghis Khan had taken his vision and expanded it beyond imagination. It was an empire of contrasts, terror and prosperity, destruction and flourishing trade, brutal conquest and sophisticated administration. For contemporaries, it seemed as though the Mongols were unstoppable, the chosen instruments of fate under the eternal blue sky. In truth, the empire had reached its peak, and the seeds of decline were already planted. But in this moment, in the age of the successors, the Mongols stood unmatched, the most powerful force the world had ever known. The Mongol Empire was not only the most formidable war machine of its age, but also a paradox of history, both destroyers and connectors, annihilators and facilitators of exchange. At the height of their power, the Mongols reshaped Eurasia in ways that went far beyond conquest, leaving behind a legacy of remarkable achievements interwoven with terrifying contradictions. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Mongol rule was the revival of the Silk Road. For centuries, this ancient network of trade routes had carried goods, ideas, and religions between East and West. But it was often fractured by wars, bandits, and competing states. Under Mongol control, the road became a secure highway across continents. The Pax Mongolica ensured that caravans could travel from China to the Mediterranean with unprecedented safety. Silk, porcelain, and spices flowed westward. Silver, glassware, and precious textiles moved eastward. Alongside goods came knowledge papermaking, gunpowder, and the magnetic compass spread beyond China, transforming the technological foundations of the Old World. The Mongols, who themselves produced little in terms of luxury goods, became the facilitators of global exchange, linking civilizations that had once been distant worlds. To sustain this vast empire, the Mongols developed the Yam system, a network of relay stations that stretched for thousands of kilometers across the steppe. Riders could switch to fresh horses at each station, carrying messages at lightning speed. This allowed imperial orders to travel from the heart of Mongolia to Persia or China in a fraction of the time it would have taken in any other realm. The Yam not only held the empire together politically, but also supported merchants, envoys, and even foreign travelers like Marco Polo, who marveled at the efficiency of Mongol communications. In many ways, the yam was a precursor to modern postal systems, an infrastructure that knitted together a realm so vast it seemed impossible to govern. Politically, the Mongols displayed a pragmatic flexibility rare among conquerors. Rather than imposing a single rigid model, they adapted to the traditions of the lands they ruled. In China, Kublai Khan ruled as a Confucian-style emperor, establishing the Yuan dynasty. In Persia, the Ilkhans absorbed Persian bureaucratic practices and eventually Islam. In Russia, the Golden Horde dominated through a tributary system, allowing local princes to govern as long as they acknowledged Mongol supremacy. This diversity of governance allowed the Mongols to maintain control over territories too vast and culturally varied to be ruled in any single way. Yet the achievements of the Mongol Empire cannot be separated from its dark legacy of violence. Conquest came at a horrific price. The destruction of cities like Nishapur, Samarkand, Baghdad, and Kiev left behind not only ruins but mass graves. Entire populations were slaughtered, with chroniclers speaking of pyramids of skulls erected as grim warnings. Modern estimates suggest that tens of millions of people died as a direct result of Mongol invasions through massacres, famine, and the collapse of economies. For those who lived under Mongol rule, the empire could feel less like a golden age of connection and more like an age of trauma and terror. In the end, the Mongol legacy is one of contradiction. They were the world's greatest facilitators of exchange, yet also its most ruthless conquerors. They opened the Silk Road, spread technologies that would shape the modern era, and built networks of communication that spanned continents. But they also left behind a trail of devastation unmatched until the industrial wars of the 20th century. The Mongol Empire was both a bridge and a blade, a force that connected humanity even as it cut deeply into its flesh. The Mongol Empire, which had once stretched unbroken from the Pacific Ocean to the Danube, did not endure. Its rise had been meteoric, and so too was its decline. By the 14th century, the unity that Genghis Khan had forged with iron discipline and vision was unraveling. What he had built through conquest and fear could not be sustained by his descendants in the face of distance, ambition, and cultural divergence. The empire's greatest strength, its vastness, became its greatest weakness. With lands spanning Eurasia, communication and loyalty grew fragile. Rival branches of the royal family contested authority, each khanate increasingly pursuing its own interests. While Genghis had imposed the supremacy of the Great Khan in Mongolia, later rulers lacked the authority to enforce obedience. Succession crises became frequent, with different claimants vying for legitimacy. The four khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China began drifting apart, though they still acknowledged their shared heritage. In practice, they operated as separate states. Alliances were made and broken, and sometimes Mongol armies fought one another as bitterly as they once had fought outsiders. The vision of a unified Mongol world dissolved into a mosaic of competing domains. The most severe collapse of the Mongol Empire occurred in the east, where the Yuan dynasty had once stood as the highest symbol of power under Kublai Khan. At its founding, the Yuan not only unified all of China, but also built an enormous administrative apparatus that astonished figures like Marco Polo with its wealth, prosperity, and order. Yet this brilliance quickly faded as the 14th century unfolded. Heavy taxation to maintain the massive bureaucracy, combined with rampant corruption and successive natural disasters, steadily eroded public trust. The Han Chinese, long resentful of foreign rule, transformed their simmering discontent into violent uprisings that spread from the countryside into the cities. The Yuan court grew increasingly fragile, unable to manage the turmoil, becoming a giant on feet of clay. In 1368, out of this wave of resistance, the Ming dynasty emerged and struck the decisive blow, expelling the Mongols from China. The Yuan court fled northward, retreating to the steppe. They lost not only the richest land of their empire, but also the mandate of heaven, the supreme symbol of legitimacy in China. The loss of China, the jewel in the crown of Mongol conquest, was not just a military defeat, but a death knell for the prestige and global standing of the Mongol Empire, opening the path to irreversible decline. The fragmentation of the Khanates beyond China revealed the irreversible decline of the Mongol Empire. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fell into a spiral of dynastic disputes among rival heirs, coupled with prolonged financial crises that shattered its administration. Disappearing from the map by the mid-14th century, the Chagatai Khanate, already fragmented and lacking a strong central authority, further splintered into smaller states, each dominated by local warlords, leaving its power diluted and unstable. Meanwhile, the Golden Horde in Russia endured longer but faced the rising strength of Moscow alongside endless internal conflicts. Step by step, its authority was eroded, and by the late 15th century, even the Golden Horde was but a pale shadow of its former self. The empire that had once made an entire continent tremble was now breaking apart piece by piece, and after barely a century and a half of existence, the once glorious Mongol order had vanished completely. From the enthronement of Genghis Khan in 1206 to the fall of the Yuan in 1368, the Mongol Empire existed as a unified force for only about 160 years. Compared to the millennia-long dynasties of China or the centuries of Rome, it was a brief episode in world history. Yet in that brief time, the Mongols had shaken the world to its foundations. Their empire collapsed, but their impact endured. Trade networks they revived continued to link continents. Political models they experimented with influenced successor states, and the memory of their devastation haunted entire civilizations. The Mongol Empire disappeared, but the echoes of its rise and fall still reverberate. The Mongol Empire may have vanished centuries ago, but its legacy still lingers across the world. Few empires in history reshaped so many aspects of human civilization in such a short span of time. Their military conquests, political structures, and commercial networks reverberated long after the last Khanates crumbled, leaving behind both scars and seeds of transformation. Militarily, the Mongols revolutionized the way wars were fought. Their mastery of mobility, mounted archery, and psychological warfare inspired armies for generations. Even today, military historians study Mongol tactics, the feigned retreat, the rapid cavalry strike, the coordinated use of intelligence as examples of strategic brilliance. Politically, the Mongols showed remarkable pragmatism. They ruled not through a single rigid model, but by adapting to local traditions. In China, they became emperors. In Persia, Muslim rulers. In Russia, overlords extracting tribute. This flexibility helped them govern an empire of astonishing diversity. It also left enduring marks: the centralization of power in Moscow, the blending of cultures in Persia, the bureaucratic precedents in China. Commercially, the Mongols bound the continents together. By revitalizing the Silk Road and enforcing the Pax Mongolica, they allowed goods, people, and ideas to flow across Eurasia with a safety unknown for centuries. Gunpowder, paper, the compass, and even foods and crops moved along these routes, transforming societies far beyond Mongol borders. In this sense, the Mongols were reluctant midwives of globalization, connecting East and West in ways that prefigured the modern world economy. The echoes of Mongol rule still shape entire civilizations. In Russia, centuries of domination under the Golden Horde influenced political culture, fostering centralized authority and autocracy that endured into the Tsarist era. In China, the Yuan dynasty marked both humiliation under foreign rule and an era of profound cultural exchange. In Persia, the Ilkhanate fused Mongol traditions with Islamic and Persian culture, contributing to a flourishing of art and science even amid devastation. In Europe, the Mongol invasions left memories of terror, but also opened channels of trade and knowledge that linked the continent more directly with Asia. The Mongols were thus both destroyers and connectors, remembered in different ways, depending on the lands they touched. Yet for all we know of them, the Mongols remain cloaked in mystery. Where is Genghis Khan buried? Despite centuries of searching, his tomb has never been found. Legends say the funeral cortege killed all who saw it and trampled the land to erase the site. Archaeologists, adventurers, and even modern technology have sought clues, but the grave of the world's greatest conqueror remains hidden. Another mystery lies in the true human cost of Mongol conquest. Chroniclers speak of massacres numbering in the millions, but reliable figures are elusive. Some historians estimate that tens of millions perished in war, famine, and disease unleashed by Mongol campaigns. Was it 30 million? 40 million? More? The scale of suffering remains uncertain, a shadow over the empire's achievements. And finally, the greatest question of all: what was their legacy? Were the Mongols simply the most destructive force of the Middle Ages, leaving behind nothing but death and ruins? Or were they the reluctant architects of a new world order, the first empire to connect humanity on a truly global scale? Perhaps the truth is both. The Mongols were destroyers and creators, harbingers of terror and facilitators of exchange. Their legacy is not one-dimensional, but contradictory, forcing us to confront the complexity of history itself. The Mongol Empire disappeared as a political entity after just 160 years, but its impact endures. In the scars of ruined cities, in the trade routes that evolved into global commerce, in the genetic legacy of Genghis Khan, carried by millions of men today, the Mongols still live. Their story remains a reminder of how swiftly power can rise and fall, and how even the most feared conquerors cannot escape the mysteries of history.